hope you had time to at least get a little bit of lunch before enter into this next conversation. I appreciate the opportunity to moderate this panel. My name is Randy Blankenhorn. I'm the Executive Director of the Chicago Metropolitan Agency for Planning. With me is Mary Sue Barrett, who is the President of the Metropolitan Planning Council. We have Rebecca Hendrick from the University of Illinois here in Chicago. We have Annette Steinbecker from Loyola University. And finally, we have Richard Feilag from Florida State. And welcome to all of our panelists. We're here to talk about collaboration and competition and how it all comes together at the end of the day. CMAP, to a certain extent, was created because our region understood that we are one economic region, that we have to work together. And it doesn't mean that we don't have our fights on occasion, and I think we're going to talk a lot about that. But there's a basic understanding that we need to collaborate, that we need to cooperate, while at the same time, at the micro level, we're competing with each other. What I'd like to do is give all of our panelists a couple of minutes to talk about where their interest in this lies, and then we're going to get into a conversation and ultimately some questions from you to our panelists about how we're going to make all of this work. So Professor Froelich wrote a white paper for us that was included in many of the materials. And so I'd like to start with them to talk about that and your thoughts about this competition collaborative axis. Richard?
Okay. Thank you very much, Randy. Collaboration is the new black, or at least it's the new competition, in that it's become this buzzword among local governments. The Great Recession has really stimulated the interest in and the application of collaboration at the local level. And there's a couple reasons why that's the case. The fiscal stress has made local governments much more sensitive and attentive to economies of scale. Issues that have been out there for a long time, but now squeezing those dollars has become even more important. The downturn has also focused the public's attention on the decisions that are made at the local government and created pressure for efficiency that has translated into pressure to collaborate on things that everybody knows should have been done a long time ago. And I had some examples I was going to use from Florida. But this morning's first session, when the city and the county talked about the recent collaborative agreements, that seems like a great case in point, where there was recognition of efficiencies from collaboration that were out there for a long time, but it wasn't until the fiscal crisis that enough pressure was brought to bear that something happened. One of the other themes in the issue paper that I want to introduce right now is the idea that competition and collaboration can sometimes go hand in hand. And sometimes the best collaborative partners are jurisdictions that are our competitors. And that we'll see especially as collaboration deals with more difficult problems like economic development. I think there's some insights to be gained by looking at the relationship between competition and collaboration together.
Thanks. Mr. Steinberg, your thoughts as we open up.
Sure. I agree with the beginning of this, that cooperation is now the big buzzword about how local government should be providing services and what we should be focusing on. I think the big issue that we need to focus on as we start to push out against that general idea is that the possibilities for cooperation and collaboration are going to be very dependent on the types of services that we're looking at and at the types of cities and the characteristics of the cities that are going to be the ones most likely to cooperate with each other. And we need to keep that in mind so we don't keep saying we should do more of this in areas where it's not likely that we could do more. And even in some of the tough areas like economic development where we compete, there are rooms for collaboration as well. We frequently talk about this in terms of the equivalent of a business where you're interested in growing your market, more people should be buying product X. But we compete over whether they buy my product or your product. But as long as we are selling more of that product, both of us could be made better off. So there are possibilities for cooperation as well as collaboration. I'll just quickly hit a couple of the points that I think need to be considered when we're looking at the possibilities for cooperation, and these are some of the things that are in the white paper as well. There always needs to be the possibility that there are benefits, what we consider joint gains. Everyone needs to be able to get something positive out of this. It seems pretty simple, but a lot of times that can be hard to find. The second thing is that all of the people who are participating have to have some similarities in their preferences. What do they want? We want growth, but then we're divided over where does that growth occur? My jurisdiction or your jurisdiction? What type of growth? Retail or office development? More similar preferences, more stable preferences, meaning we're going to keep wanting the same things in the future. Economies of scale in the provision of particular types of services. We all want the same thing. They're going to continue. Those are going to be our easier cases for cooperation. The more different they are, the more we're going to need a higher level of authority. And again, in the white paper, there are different levels of authority in terms of the type of structures we could use to achieve collaboration. And the last thing is the level of investment and the specificity of the investment that we're asking the local governments to engage in. And again, how different are they across the cities? Because if I'm going to make a contribution, I need to, and I'm going to be committed to it for a very long period of time, I need to know that the other people involved aren't going to disappear, that for some reason they are also going to remain a part of this. It's not necessarily dollars that we are contributing, but also if I make a choice in an economic development strategy that's contingent on what the region as a whole is doing, boosting tourism, boosting new manufacturing, then I need to know that that's something that the rest of my partners are going to continue with. Otherwise, I've invested a lot that I could lose. If they're also investing a lot, the more similar we are in our investments, the more similar we are in our preferences, the more stable that is over the longer period of time. Those are going to be situations in which it's easier to establish voluntary cooperation.
Thanks. Dr. Hendrick.
Thank you very much. I think many of the comments that were stated in the first session were very accurate about the Chicago metropolitan region and their likelihood of collaboration. I'd like to mention one particular thing that came out of the white paper, which I think is very true, is that collaboration tends to occur in a bilateral arrangement. What that means is that you have collaboration between two or a few governments rather than on a regional level. And I think collaboration on a regional level, especially in the Chicago metropolitan area, as mentioned by those folks today, is the goal that we need to achieve in order to be competitive with Germany and England and other places. But that, I think, is going to be very difficult to achieve. As pointed out by some of the speakers today, Chicago is a very political place. My own research has shown that and I think the tax structure, even though, as Richard says, collaboration and competition can exist together. Yes, but I think the things that contribute to competition also hinder collaboration. And I think our tax structure, for instance, especially at the local level with respect to sales taxes, helps contribute to that competition, the disalignment of incentives, of goals, of preferences that depress collaboration here. And I think this particular region is going to have to try to deal with some of these things in order to meet this. A couple of things I wanted to point out that the speakers this morning mentioned as to what's going to be very critical to increase collaboration is leadership. I think it is incumbent upon the leaders to sort of bring people forward and not just to sort of guide them or let them see that their preferences do indeed or can align, but also to sort of help them see what types of collaborative opportunities are possible. Now, I talked to a lot of consultants, I talked to a lot of finance directors and municipal managers in suburban governments, and one of the interesting things that has come out of that is not only is collaboration popular, it's kind of the happy talk today, but you see a lot of consultants pursuing that option, and they almost function, I would say, as like diffusion agents. So And so this opportunity or this, to be able to see that collaboration is possible and what is possible out there, I think that to the extent that we can envision that, I think collaboration can move forward in this region. Other than that, I think Chicago, it's my own, I don't have any evidence of this, but I suspect that the Chicago metropolitan region is fairly well behind the game when it comes to collaboration by comparison to a lot of other metropolitan regions out there.
Thank you. Mary Sue?
And hopefully catching up. I'm Mary Sue Barrett, President of the Metropolitan Planning Council. We're an intermediary of sorts. We're a non-governmental, nonpartisan organization that works on improved policies to make this region thrive. And so this research was extremely interesting to me. There's a lot of talk in our business about governmental consolidation, and there's a lot of brain damage that's been caused by that discussion. What has bubbled up as a result of the Great Recession is some promising collaboratives that I want to share with you briefly. The Metropolitan Planning Council, Chicago Metropolitan Agency for Planning, and the Metropolitan Mayor's Caucus have collaborated on a paper we're releasing next week, so I'm previewing some of that for you. And the takeaways is that you do have to customize what has been learned in other places to the particular locations. But in our region, which is known for more units of local government, more single-purpose taxing districts than any other place in the country, we're ripe for applying these tools. In South, West, and Northwest Cook, there have been over the last several years collaboratives formed, sparked by the foreclosure crisis. Primarily that was the driver that brought people to the table. We learned a lot from another coalition, a collaborative that was formed in suburban Seattle. Started with 3 municipalities, Bellevue, Washington, as some of you know, that was among the higher capacity communities, and 2 others, and that has grown to 15. But they've a track record that's longer that we learned some things from. And the leadership came from the councils of government or clusters of mayors. A little different in each place, but Ed Pazel's here from the South Suburban Mayors and Managers. They're the most sophisticated, largest scale collaborative, and it's got a direct connection to this council of government. West Cook and North Cook look a little different and are 5 towns each, but what they've started on is the idea of shared staff capacity, shared applications for funding, planning together, and then that leading to attracting private investment. So we're kind of midway through that trajectory of the shared planning has happened, the shared staffing has happened. There's a great statistic that's been gathered about dollars leveraged. 53, mostly federal dollars, but other governmental dollars have leveraged the dollars that these communities have put into it. So it's a huge return on investment, but that's all on the input, kind of getting ready for shared action. What we are poised to show more of is the development opportunities together. So things like overlay zoning, working on economic development, cargo-oriented development is a particular priority in both South and West clusters in Cook County. So I think the lessons learned is that we jumped into collaboration because we had a crisis, we had to act, we had to move. And the Metropolitan Planning Council was one of several organizations providing technical assistance. We now have to circle back and get our structures right. So there's some good things to learn. The Federal Reserve Bank has done some documentation, and now we with our partners have done more. And we have to go back and fine-tune those to make sure that there's the capacity to change some really dated rules that actually prevent collaboratives from applying jointly or acting jointly. Remove those barriers and actually secure some additional incentives.
Thanks. I want to start with a little bit of the conversation that I believe intellectually our leaders get this collaboration thing. How do we get them to think of it operationally? I think, Annette, you said we have to talk about benefits. We have to talk about how that works, how everybody benefits from whatever collaborative you're doing. How do we make that work on the ground in our communities?
That is a good question. The how-to is always the tricky part. And I guess I would say, to start with, we need to focus on the specific services that we are going to be looking at. And we can start with some of the easier ones, where it's clear that everyone has the potential benefits, and they might even be the things that are easier to document in terms of the dollars saved. so that we can put that information out. That gives you a point to start from. And once we've built a little bit of a track record of working together, then we might be able to move on to some of the more difficult things, some of the things that are harder to quantify, to know what the benefits might actually be. I think one of the other tricky things about this is even though there are benefits to be gained, if there are extremely different levels of benefits to be gained, that's a very difficult cooperative situation as well, because you might do better, but if your partner is going to be doing so much better, you're afraid that you're making your position worse off long term. So you need to be very sensitive to what those benefits might be and how to approach them. Possibly linking across a couple of different issues may also be helpful. And I highlight some of the things that make it easy to start with, also make it a lot easier for the things to dissolve in the future.
So Richard, this is kind of the basis of the white papers. How do you go from intellectually I understand that working together is in all of our best interest, and yet I'm going to still steal your car dealership? How do we get that competition and collaboration to work in that sense?
Okay. You're right that the public officials understand that it's zero sum and that there's a collective benefit from working together. The issue is their individual incentives, that aligning not just the economic incentive but the political incentives, where it's in the interest of the actors to work together, is a key part of that. That's what Mary Sue was describing, and Annette was emphasizing, of starting small, starting on small projects as a way of developing relationships, because one of the big barriers to collaboration is trust. And working together and getting to know partners and identify partners and build trust is important. Another key issue is uncertainty. Uncertainty over what the real consequences of collaborative action are going to be, uncertainty about the division of benefits and costs. That to the extent to which we have better information and we can reduce uncertainty, it reduces the risk for public officials to engage in these types of collaborations.
And Mary Sue, you talked when we were having a pre-conversation about how do we define costs and how do we define benefits. And I know we don't have answers yet, but where do you think this goes? How do we get to that point?
Just mapping out assets and shared opportunities. I think Annette's advice to us is really sound. That you're going to see a greater likelihood of success if you can pinpoint that shared outcome together. So, for example, I'm going to lean on the South Suburban example again. They have already, even though this is a young collaborative, formed a South Suburban land bank. Again, starting with 3 of the towns, with intent now to expand, and a transit-oriented development fund that is capitalized. That allows communities to sequence projects. I think what Seattle has done that we ought to look at bringing in as the next level of sophistication to our collaborative work around the region is to actually have the communities put some skin in the game financially themselves and broker a development pipeline of priorities, shared priorities, and individual action, where they know that over the course of 5 years, if there's 5 towns, maybe in 2013 your project's not going to get done, but in 2015 it will. And so I think that certainty, where your resources are helping the collective goal move forward. So tools is part, and then brokering the work plan together.
At the end of the day, I like the way you said it, that it's not about how I get my share of the pie, it's about how we increase the pie.
Yep.
And I think that, how do we convince, and Rebecca, with the work that you've done and looking at it from that financial perspective and the budgeting perspective, how do we convince local officials that the pie can get bigger? That my goal is not to take fewer jobs, it's to create new jobs for all of us.
It's about seeing the space in which there is alignment, in which there is agreement with the goals. And I think government officials always don't see that. And to kind of get back to Annette's point about costs, and it is about starting, I think, with the little projects or the smaller areas of collaboration where governments feel that it's not so risky. So I think if you look at where collaboration does tend to take place, as Mary Sue has talked about, the COGS are very important in bringing governments together in order to be able to see those areas where they do have common interests. But if you look at the kinds of collaborative efforts that COGS are supporting, it's also kind of the boring, simple stuff. It's like purchasing pools and land banks and personnel training and these administrative areas, as opposed to, I think governments look at police, fire, the core services as being very risky areas to collaborate in, but I'm not so sure that that's the case. I think it's just a matter of sort of pointing out to government officials where they do have commonalities.
And one of the things that I think is not unique to metropolitan Chicago is not the town-to-town competition per se between, but leader-to-leader competition. And how do we take the good examples that are being set around this region and make them more commonplace? Because I know for my mayors, there's nothing that they hate worse than having one of their residents come up to them and say, how come we're not doing what next door is doing? So Richard, we'll start with you. How do we use those best examples as a way to explain that collaboration is an opportunity?
Collaboration is an opportunity, but it's also a risk. And for elected officials, one of the biggest risks is being seen as a sucker, to being outdone by a neighboring jurisdiction, to entering into a bad deal. That we know would oftentimes on areas like development, that cities enter into bad deals with business, for instance, but that isn't a visible consequence for, in a lot of cases, many years. That in formulating initial agreements, they're visible, they are politically risky, and so the things that we've already been talking about, so, starting small and developing an understanding of your partners, and so and really understanding when it's in their interest at the individual level to work with you, to reduce your risk, to build those relationships, and then to institutionalize those relationships. And at the first panel, they talked about collaboration starting out as informal, but then building on that and trying to formalize it where possible. And I think Mary Sue was talking about doing that in the Cook County collaboration as well.
Rebecca, what are your thoughts on that, and how we leverage some of this good competition?
Well, you're entirely correct when you say that that government officials compare themselves to each other. In my book, I call it the Lake Wobegon effect, where all property taxes are below average. And government officials do, economists call this yardstick competition. It's not sort of the direct competition you might get in economic development, but it's that's one of the difficult questions. I mean, how do you transform that into something that is more collaborative, more in which people are working together, as opposed to sort of trying to outdo their neighbors? But to some extent, I think maybe we can even sort of play off of that. And if they are sort of looking at each other to see what each other is doing, if their neighbors are collaborating with other neighbors, then that, I think, is going to motivate them to say, hey, let's take a look at this.
Mary Sue?
I love Richard's frame of collaboration being the new competitive edge. I do think there's a little bit of peer pressure developing within our region for healthy collaboratives. If you're leveraging a significant amount of dollars, if you've attracted foundation resources to hire shared staff, others are noticing that. There's been a lot of good talk of the Sustainable Communities Initiative at the federal level about getting cross-agency funding, and there's been a few examples of that, but it really hasn't permeated. If we can make some progress now in Obama's second term of seeing, not just Department of Transportation funding flowing to regional and sub-regional collaboratives, but Commerce and US EPA and others saying, we want to reward these joint action because it's the efficient way to go. Shared priorities, you're achieving, air quality and water quality and economic development goals all together in one project. You cannot achieve those goals except on a bigger scale. It's impossible. So if we have the right metrics and then we kind of reconfigure the funding flows, then I think we've we've just created a new healthy kind of competition.
You know, and I think it's important to say, I don't think this has been mentioned in any of the panels yet, but I think the state has to be sort of proactive in doing things to promote competition. Now, the state of Illinois has one of the most, I guess, liberal intergovernmental local agreements in which it allows non-home rule governments in the state to not have to go to the state to ask them if they can engage in cooperation. But I think the state could do a lot more in terms of how it structures grants, especially in the area of environmental areas, drainage, these other areas. To some extent, I think larger governments have to be involved and can be involved in restructuring these incentives.
So Annette, what is that vertical discussion? How does that come into play between local governments and local and county, local and state, local and federal?
I'm not sure how I would say how it comes into play. I would say that I think of that as the dimension of what are the tougher nuts to crack, and those are going to be the ones where it's necessary to have the higher levels of government involved. The easier ones where our preferences are aligned, we want the same things, it's economies of scale, everybody is going to save money if we do this. Those are the ones that we could agree to voluntarily, and we don't need the state's help as much. The ones where our incentives might be a little out of alignment, we're competing over who gets that car dealership, that's going to be the types of situations where the state's going to be necessary in order to structure the incentives correctly, in order to enforce that the cities might have some skin in the game themselves. We often think of this as it's the equivalent of sort of posting a bond that as long as you go along with this, you don't lose out on the money that you put in, and everybody else sees that, so they feel like there's an insurance policy in place. But if you ever pull back, then you've lost whatever your bond is. So if we structure things in a particular way that you lose certain state grants or opportunities if you don't participate in this type of cooperation. Those types of structures can be helpful and might be necessary to state or the federal government in order to get those kinds of alignments on some of the tougher structures. The other thing that I would mention is that in a lot of cases it might be beneficial to think about these things in terms of short-term or defined term agreements. That one of the issues that we've seen in other areas where you're trying to develop some kind of cooperation is that people are reluctant to commit at the beginning because they aren't sure how things are going to change over time, this uncertainty dimension. So I don't want to commit myself now to something that 5 years from now I would be at a disadvantage. If we structure it so it's a 5-year agreement, or up until X occurs, then we would dissolve the agreement voluntarily and renegotiate again at that point. That gives people, again, that kind of introduction, feet wet, not as much of a risk, and by the time they're through with that, they may have discovered just how large those benefits really were and had a chance to show their constituents exactly that.
Before I move on this, I want to make sure that you all know that we have time for questions and answers at the end of this. And the staff is going to be collecting questions, so if you have them, write them down. We'll get through as many of them as we can. Richard, I'll start with you on this. We've talked at CMAP a lot about how government needs to be more efficient, and collaboration is truly one of the ways, particularly in certain types of services, where those inefficiencies can play in this economy. As the economy improves, how does that impact our ability and our interest in collaboration? Do we have a window of time and it goes away, or do we have a window of time that we build on?
That's a real good question. I started out by saying that the Great Recession has created an opportunity and stimulated collaboration. The more important question is, how can it be sustained? How can it be maintained? Collaborative relationships, if they can be formalized, if you can take the informal collaboration that bubbles up from opportunities for things like economies of scale and try them in practice, and where they work, then develop contracts or create sort of formal structures and bodies to actually have ownership of these collaborations. That's certainly one way. Part of it is a change in the culture. The the change that we're talking about, I think it's more than just sort of a short term. It's the recognition that collaboration is part of good governance, and that's already seen in the way that planners are trained and public administrators are trained, and the professional organizations in the field, that the city management organizations value collaboration as an innovative management technique, and I think it's that change of perception and culture is going beyond those professional fields to the public. And to follow up on the last point that the rest of the panel was making about the role of the state, the role that state government plays is critical to being able to maintain and institutionalize collaborative efforts. That collaboration can range from what Annette calls the really difficult problems, where the state essentially has to come in and impose collaboration, to consolidate things, to get rid of existing structures, to incentivizing collaboration, to empowering collaboration, like Rebecca was talking about. At a minimum, not throwing up obstacles and roadblocks to collaboration. Mary Sue's talking about grant requirements. You would hope that there would be incentives and rewards from partnering and collaborating, but we even have situations where communities are restricted from being able to collaborate on their applications. So support from the state, developing a culture, and institutionalizing the informal relationships that develop.
Yeah, and I do think that's a really good point. That I think the professionals in the field, and we planners, we know everything, so we're good. And, we get all this. It's when I'm a mayor, and a long-range plan for me is my next election. How do we make sure that the structures are in place, and that you've done some work on this. How do we keep that where we need for longer lasting? I like the 5-year, the shorter term agreements, so a mayor can see where that's going. Are there other tools that we can use?
Some of that is that within that same kind of structure, combining what Rick was talking about, and if we've started with some of the informal collaborations, once we've got that agreement in place, can we now formalize it with some structural changes? So we now institute particular forms of government or agreements that we are become accustomed to signing off on. So it's kind of, we've moved up to this level, and then we put in kind of a safety net so we can't drop back further than that in the next round. And then we kind of push it up a little bit more and put a new structure in under place to kind of prevent it from dropping back down. And I think it is that habit of collaboration that is helpful. I also think that one of the things to be aware of is that, again, certain groups are going to be more likely to collaborate and to sustain the collaboration. Relatively equal partners are ones that it's fairly easy to form something and they're likely to stick with it. One of the infamous examples in Southern California, where I was before, was of an economic development association that had formed when all of the cities were about the same size. As one city took off, they discovered that they didn't really see any reason to continue to participate and to pay dues to the Economic Development Corporation, because all of the things that they were doing, which was general marketing and branding for the area, the city could do for itself at about the same cost. And once they pulled out, the rest of the threads pretty much unraveled because they were one of the major participants. So that really started with everybody about the same. As one person took off and became more dominant, it becomes easy for them to pull out. Along the way, you would have had to move them from being more voluntary to being a tighter structure so that they wouldn't have had as easy an opportunity and as much of an incentive to think of themselves going out on their own.
So Rebecca, in your work in the public finance area in particular, how do you see the collaboration that takes place from an efficient government standpoint? From they get it today, how are they going to get it tomorrow?
Well, you talk about mayors collaborating, but I don't think it has to be mayors. There's a lot of decisions that go on, a lot of administrative, financial decisions that go on with the finance director, with the municipal manager, with the administrator, with the fire chief, with the police chief, and so on. I mean, those entities can begin collaboration
at some of the boring levels that I talked about. And then that in turn, as they sort of say, hey, this is working, that kind of bubbles up to the board and then to the mayor.
So Mary Sue, we've got these 3 collaboratives that are ongoing today, and we all have high hopes for it. So where do you think structurally, are there structures beyond where we are today that you think need to be in place to either keep them moving or in some of the cases to expand the geographic reach of them?
Like in that we're creating some of our own infamous stories, even locally. There are, even in the short track record of years, these collaboratives were formed in the last 2 to 3 years. There's specific examples of county, state, and federal programs where, that governmental partner across the table said, we think it's great that you're working together. Now you have to apply separately, literally. And, or of the 15 towns, 7 of you are eligible and the rest of you are not eligible, so you can't use the dollars here. That kind of, it's definitely an unintended consequence. And yet, the granting government agency says, we can't do anything. These are 1970s era program regulations and I have to do it this way because that's what it says. So I think we have to simultaneously fine-tune our own structures and those internal commitments, expand staff capacity, demonstrate success, so use some of these tools like the land bank and the development funds to show, hey, look, something happened that would not have otherwise happened. But then put a portion of our effort into not just the backyard, attending to your backyard issues, but simultaneously lift our sights and be active on the state and national level, because I think we've got a lot to teach. There's great interest in Chicagoland as a laboratory for the nation. We are doing something that's nationally significant here, and we have to engage in that discussion. It's not easy, but if we fix some of these barriers, structural barriers, many other collaboratives would benefit.
So change in metropolitan Chicago has infrequently been government-led. It's because of our business communities, our civic communities, our educational institutions that really force change in this region. Where do they fit in the discussion? And since Mary Sue, that's you, and actually it's all of you, where do the non-governmental players fit in this conversation, and how can they move the needle?
I want to give a lot of credit to the local governments who started the hard work. So maybe the traditional trajectory is not government-led, but the fact that there is willingness to try a different approach, really the credit does go to local governments. And there's many other collaboratives. We're working with a similar collaborative in Northwest Indiana around Gary. We're working with 80 communities along the Fox River corridor on water supply issues. So I think they can be on multiple topics and multiple scales. But there's a Goldilocks element to this of the just right size. I think if it's so big with an agenda that's so broad, it's harder for people to get their arms around. The non-governmental players, I think, have a role to document, communicate, and replicate. So we can't walk away from these collaboratives. They need our help. But we have to, as I was suggesting before, split some of our time and effort so that we're helping them succeed, and then we're helping the next wave of ones, some of which come through your local technical assistance, planning, grant programs, and then the voices of the private sector saying that this is a promising strategy, or from academic research partners to say, we've looked at this and we've looked at different models and this holds promise, and if we could restructure and reward more of this, that would be a good thing. I think we haven't done the homework on the cost-benefit analysis, and the advocates need that to be able to make the case.
So all of you from the university side, and I'll start with you, where do you fit? How do you help advance the discussion? And more important than the discussion, the practice.
Well,
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I think in our teaching, for instance, is foremost. In terms of making students aware of what is out there, what's available. One of the things I'd like to point out that we haven't sort of mentioned is Richard's comment about networks, how important networks are in this collaborative arrangement. And it's not just networks between local governments, it's networks, for instance, with social service agencies. You look at social service provision in this region and in this state, and it's not just collaboration between governments, it's horizontally or vertically, it also includes the nonprofit and in some cases the private sector. And so making people aware, again, making students aware that this is an option, that it's not just sort of the standard sort of hierarchical bureaucratic administration, that management now is about networking. It's not just about managing a group of employees, it's about maintaining those networks and looking for opportunities to govern in a different way.
The ability to better solve problems depends on being able to bring to bear sort of the knowledge and skills of multiple organizations. And the nature of the problems means oftentimes they spill over borders, and so you need more than one jurisdiction to effectively address the problem. The problems spill across the communities, and not-for-profits and other organizations are critical partners to be able to successfully address those problems. That nonprofits also play an important role in shaping the predispositions and the incentives of elected officials as well, because they're the constituency for collaboration a lot of times, that they see and value the good governance from collaboration, and can be entrepreneurs that can work along with other participants to reshape the incentives of the elected officials that make those choices. But I agree with Becca 100% that where we make the most difference is educating students, and we're involved in professional programs at the graduate level. We're training people for policy positions, for management positions, and to understand the role of collaboration as a normative value, as well as an analytic technique and a management tool, I think are all important.
And we have the potential to do some of the things that Mary Sue had mentioned in terms of identifying what the cost and the benefits might be and how we should measure them, and particularly when we're dealing with smaller levels of government who don't have that in-house analytical capacity. Universities are places where we do have some of the resources, and students who would love the practice, a few of mine are in the room. I'm sure a few of Rebecca's as well. So that we have some resources that we could bring to the table as well to help provide the tools that the nonprofits and the governments might need. One other point I was thinking of when Rick was mentioning the boundaries and the nonprofits, one of the advantages is that all of these different organizations technically would have different boundaries. The nonprofits are not necessarily serving within the city of Chicago or the city of Evanston. They cross the boundaries, and because they have different boundaries, if they are talking with each other, so government officials with nonprofits, with educational institutions, we all see our geographic scope differently, and that makes it easier as well to develop different networks and to identify possibilities to work together.
I'm going to say right up front that we've got a lot of great questions here that we are not going to get to all of them, unfortunately, but I've tried to a certain extent, combine them into similar topics, and since I'm the moderator, I get to start with my favorite one, which is the fact that Northeastern Illinois has more units of government than anywhere else in the world. It's not our number one that we should be proud of. But the question comes, and I think it's a legitimate question, particularly in small units of government, is collaboration enough? Should we actually be talking about consolidation?
You can talk about it, but politically it won't happen.
I know townships kind of have a bullseye on consolidation. And I had done a study with one of my colleagues, Karen Mossberger, looking at townships and how they work with social services. And one of the things we found is how relevant some townships, not all of them, sort of take the general assistance mission and expand it into other areas of social services. But there were some in particular that did that and became very, very critical in that collaborative network arrangement for delivery of social services. So
I think we need to kind of, I mean, the literature tells us, and Rick knows this, that there are advantages to having a lot of governments. I mean, there are, you know, the founders of this country talked about the importance of fragmentation and decentralization. So I'm not sure that consolidation is necessarily the answer. I think we're going to have to look at that more carefully.
Certainly, consolidation isn't the only answer. Public administration traditionally has sort of gravitated on that as a solution because it sort of brings to bear our skills and expertise in designing hierarchical organizations. But the interactions of small units provides the adaptability, the flexibility, the resilience oftentimes to deal with problems that a larger consolidated government would have difficulty with. There are situations where that would be the best choice, but in real terms, it's practically a politically impossible choice. And so then the question is, given that political reality of this fragmented system, are there collaborative solutions that can rise up among the actions of these multiple units of government?
So a lot of the questions that have come in have suggested that collaboration between communities is the focus of this, and it's one thing, but how do we think about collaboration in a broader regional perspective? For example, state lines seem to matter in our collaboration here between Northwest Indiana, Southeast Wisconsin, Metropolitan Chicago, and Illinois. How do we get that bigger picture collaboration that's more on a policy level than on a services level? How does that work? I know, Mayor Sue, you work across state lines. Why don't we start with you?
Well, we both do, and you were also involved with the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development's, OECD's report on the tri-state region. There's some fledgling efforts right now to form a tri-state alliance and define its shared agenda across southeastern Wisconsin, northwest Indiana, and northeastern Illinois. Some business leaders from each of those three states have been named already. And there are opportunities. We've talked at some length about the tri-state region having a competitive advantage for water-intensive industries. Instead of each going separately after that slice, we have a shared Lake Michigan basin. Let's go after it together, and it definitely is something that we can all win on. I think it's really blowing up the conversation to the next level that we've been having here. I don't think it's a different conversation. Getting the incentives right, defining the right priorities, having some sort of shared capacity. Those are the ingredients that you would need to pay attention to make this work. And I also think that the governmental consolidation debate, there's a lot of rich literature and academic work in this area. I would view that as a continuum as well, that as you look at, for example, a collaborative, then contracting for some sort of service delivered by a non-governmental organization or a private provider, you learn some things from that experience, and then you naturally ask the question, well, do I need some staff expertise on that if I'm getting good value for the buck? And if each of these it's important to do, practice, to learn, but it's really important to document. So that's where I think the tri-state discussion has been so hard to get started, because we haven't really done much together. We just look at the lines on the map and we know how people commute between Lake County and between southeast Wisconsin and into Lake County and from northwest Indiana on the South Shore line into Chicago. Those are huge flows every day. But other than that, our political leaders really don't have any reason why they should look at, for example, cargo development across Indiana and Illinois. But there's some great potential there.
Rebecca, the work that you did, mainly in the suburban tax policy and public finance, did you look at those border communities and what it meant across state lines? And are there ways that we should be thinking about this differently?
You mean in Wisconsin borders or in Indiana borders?
Either one.
Add more.
It's when we talk about some of the, how do we get together regionally, and at the state level, in the bigger region, let's call it the Southern Lake Michigan region, our governors don't have much interest in that because they're elected for the state. But, and so in the work that you did in the public finance area, is there something locally across that isn't all competitive because I can buy gas cheaper in Indiana than Illinois? Or are there things that you found that show potential?
I hate to say it, not.
I'm not surprised, but that's okay.
I mean, yes, it is very competitive in that respect. And even within the suburban areas, especially, and I mentioned before, sales taxes. I mean, the state of Illinois, not only can the local governments here, municipalities and counties issue sales taxes, but the state distributes its shared sales tax via point of sale. And so that really does set up a very competitive situation, even between municipalities, and especially between municipalities that are across state lines too. And so you see the automobile dealerships that, jump from municipality to municipality. And that is, I found that to be a huge motivating factor in everything that these municipal governments do. Not only in the area of economic development, but also the sales taxes help them help them lower, in effect, their property taxes. And property taxes are a very visible tax. Nobody likes that. And, these local governments view their ability to levy more sales taxes as being able to export their taxes to non-residents. That's very, attractive.
Yeah, we at CMAP concluded earlier this year a tax policy task force. And to me, one of the interesting parts of it was the difference in the conversation between our business and academic members of our task force and our local government on what is the impact of sales tax. And we've got a follow-up work going on about those incentives at this point in time. So do you feel as pessimistic about this bigger?
Pessimistic on one side, optimistic on the other. The pessimistic is when you were talking about the governors. Not only do they have no interest, they of course pit communities against each other. When Wisconsin's governor is saying he will create 10,000 new jobs, and by the way, I'm going to get like 8,000 of them from Illinois, that does not help. So I'm pessimistic in that respect because there are political reasons clearly for governors to take that kind of stance. I'm a little more optimistic in that there might be some potential for, again, to start small and start easy and build up. That if we're really talking about economic growth, communities that are similar and have a similar sort of tax base and economic goals can start working together. There's not as much benefit from that because the gains that from working together are not as high when all we're trying to do is develop our own little retail areas. But once we start working together to solve this type of problem, now we are kind of in agreement on what we should do for local retail. Now we can start talking to some of the other entities about what should we do about office building construction and what should we do about these other things. So if we build up piece by piece, the true advantage of and the economic strength of a Chicagoland or tri-state metropolitan area in competing globally is to be able to say, we have covered all parts of the economic spectrum, and we're now in agreement. We started with this, and then we added on this, and then we added on this. The more pieces that we have that we can say we are in agreement that we aren't competing on because we worked out those step by step, then the stronger we can become when we're competing against other communities. And it's the fact that we might be losing out against other communities that may benefit us. My last point on the Water Council, I have some ties to Milwaukee, and they've really been pushing that. And one of the things that they have now started talking about too is they don't think of it as Milwaukee competing with other areas like Chicago. They think of it as competing with Singapore and other countries that are also trying to develop this Water Council perspective. That might be some of the motivation to bring us together.
There's nothing like an external threat to
And
make
if
people
we
realize that,
some of the smaller cooperation, and now we've got the external threats, so boy, we really do have common interests.
So all of you have said, start small. Give me examples of where to start small and how to start small. What is it that we can do very specifically, and just give me one example from each of you, of how to start and what it takes to even make that first step. Richard?
In Tallahassee and Leon County, they have a separate municipal police force and county sheriff's office that have battled over territory for a long time. That one issue which they finally were able to agree upon was consolidating the emergency call system. The tremendous public benefit from doing that, and tremendous pressure for them to play well together to do that. But that experience has led to more intergovernmental agreements where they are agreeing to sort of share territory and not directly compete where they were in the past.
So what was the tipping point for after all of these years that they agreed to consolidate dispatch? Was it the leaders, or was it an issue, or was it just time?
All three, but it became politicized, and there were some visible incidents where the lack of cooperation had real consequences, and probably without that, it wouldn't have happened. Public safety is somewhat difficult collaboration area because of some of the nature of the actors there. Economic development, like Annette's describing, is even more difficult. And Becca talked about sort of point of sale sales tax. That creates this tremendous interest to act individually. Trying to sort of start there and agree not to compete on those things is almost doomed for failure. But you have to start with smaller things. And with incentives, what some communities have done is agreed to require performance agreements of firms that they're offering incentives to, which increases the information, allows them to make better deals, and is in some ways a restriction on competition, because if you try to require a performance agreement, they're not going to say, well, we'll just go down the road to a neighbor, which won't make us do that.
And this has been your key message. Where do we start?
Yes, and I'm trying to think of any examples that were successful. Well, and a couple that I can think of. One would be, it's a harder one to replicate, but the example that I was thinking of involved a particular city official who then moved to the county. And because he also had ties to those people, he'd work with them, there was that trust, that willingness to work together, and he, at the city level, had reasons to think about cities competing with each other. Once he moved to the county, he started trying to provide more incentives and just conversations with each other over, we aren't going to compete. I know this city won't play that game, so we'll try and provide incentives in a different way. So my message with that one was really kind of the takeaway of, if you have certain government officials who move within the area to different jobs, that can actually help. The other one that I was thinking of, and it was a little bit trickier, it was a situation involving airports, ironically. That's a touchy one around here. But in this case, what was working is that some of the airports were built so much to capacity and their neighbors were so objecting to any possible expansion that they had incentives to start working then with agreements with other airports to say, okay, we'll move more of the cargo flights there and develop better rail transportation. So in this case, severe constraints on one part in the system led them to have motivations to talk with another. And once they started working together on airports, then it evolved into other rail, other transportation types of issues as well.
Rebecca?
I'm trying to think of somebody like Annette. I'm trying to think of which ones worked. Examples. I mean, most of them I think are fairly on a small scale. What Rich was talking about with the dispatch. But I would say that the COGS are an excellent example, especially the Metropolitan Mayor's Caucus is an excellent example of collaborative relationships at a broader than just bilateral level, because it brings in a number of governments. And so I'm not familiar with South Suburban Mayors and Managers Conference, but I know the Northwest Municipals Conference, for instance, has a purchasing pool, I believe.
They do.
Does SSMMA have anything like that? Are you? Okay. So I think, and I believe there's other COGs that may have training for personnel kinds of training. That's an excellent example of collaboration.
not that long ago, I believe it was, and this was an example, I think, of an unsuccessful effort, and made you question whether or not this was collaboration, but it was Blue Island with several other suburban governments around them. The mayor there was trying to create a separate fire district, trying to get these governments to sort of give up their fire departments and create a fire district, which is creating another new government. We're going anti-consolidation there. But that is an example of collaboration. Now that wasn't successful, and I'm not quite sure why. I suspect it was because, again, it's that core service, you know, the risks that are involved in these governments giving up the ownership of these very valuable services. But what are some other examples? I've heard of St. Charles, Geneva, and what's the other suburb, starts with a B? Batavia. They do a lot. I know they have a lot of collaboration together.
So Mary Sue, we think that we have some that are working. What do you think, to close this out, what do you think was the key to tipping those into something that really became operational? That people said, the time is right, the time is now, and these are the issues we're going to collaborate.
Well, wrapping together a number of the terrific nuggets we've heard, understanding of shared assets, crisis with, you know, pushing people's back up against the wall, and an opportunity for near-term successes together. The trust had already been built, which is the real answer about why these collaborations were able to move forward, and they were able to put some of the pieces together. I think the other, those are things you can control locally, and as I've mentioned a couple of times, we need some help outside of our own localities to create the environment for collaboratives to succeed. So my big idea that maybe we can start small on is to have a cross-federal agency funding pool a la CDBG, a competitive one, not a formula one, where only collaboratives could apply. And start small is maybe try it in 5 or 6 places.
One of them being.
One of them being, no question.
Well, I want to thank our panelists for a very interesting conversation. I hope that you found it useful. For the next group of sessions, the Health, Safety, and Welfare panel will begin in this room at 1:30. And if you're attending the Paying for Past Decisions panel, you'll move upstairs into rooms G, H, and I. So thank you for attending, and we hope that you found it informative.